This is Pastor Tom Arnould welcoming you to the Good News Radio broadcast. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16, "Upon this rock will I build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." On today's program, my wife Sharon will be joining me as we discuss the importance of the local church. God's desire is that every Christian would be connected to a church family. Join me for part 2 of the message, The Importance of the Local Church.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of the Good News Radio broadcast with Pastor Tom Arnould. Tom serves as pastor of Good News Church in Yukon, Oklahoma, and is our teacher on this daily program. It is his desire that you will discover God's abundant plan for every aspect of your life through the faithful study of God's Word. Join us now as we go into today's message.
Well, it's an honor to have you again today on the Good News Radio broadcast. We're in the studio today, and I have with me my wife, Sharon Arnould, and I'm so glad that Sharon is with me. We've never done this in the years that I've been on radio where she's joined me, but Sharon, thanks for being with me in the studio today.
You're welcome.
You know, Sharon and I work together so much that, we are united in ministry, we're united in marriage, and Sharon gives me a lot of objectivity. Everybody's got blind spots, and Sharon helps me with those blind spots. So one thing I can tell you about my wife, she loves the local church. She loves church. Whether we're together in the Czech Republic ministering, we love the church there. We love pastors. When we go visit those churches, we love those churches. And, you know, if we do a word count today on how many times we use the word church, it's going to be a lot. But I'm going to read a passage to you. Jesus introduced this word to us in Matthew 16, when he said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So I'm just going to make a few comments, and then we're going to get some input from Sharon here. Number one, every Christian needs to be a part of a local church family. Any thoughts on that, Sharon?
Amen. I agree.
You know, I think sometimes people, they get spiritual, and I hate to use the word, but it's true. They kind of get spiritual and spooky. You know, they get to missing church, and they get to legitimizing why they're not in church. But the fact is, you need to stay plugged into a local church. So if you're listening to this program and you really enjoy it, we don't want you to listen to this program or other programs to the exclusion of being plugged in to a church. Did you know there's some pastor in your community praying that God would connect him with a certain flock, a certain congregation, and you showing up there will be an answer to his prayer? And as we covered in the last program, it's important that we not just attend church, but we want to get involved in church. One way we get involved is through volunteering. And we're going to talk on the big one here, supporting the church financially. You know, I used to tease everybody at the church. We had these older chairs, and I said, you know, somebody's paid for the chair you're sitting on. And I know some people thought, well, I wish they had to spend a little more money, you know. But the fact is, everything in the church, the sound system, the lighting, the utilities, the building itself, all the insurance, all the liability, everything, the church band, the church, you know, transportation, all that you have, the vans, everything that you have, somebody helped pay for it. So supporting a church is not just with words, but it's also financially. Is that, any thoughts on that, Sharon?
No, I agree, because as you were talking, I was thinking, you know, we all want to be a part of something that's bigger than us, and we all want to know if what we invest in, that it's going to have a great return. And I believe that by being faithful with, you're talking about supporting financially, but when you support your local church financially, you are investing in something that has a bigger return than you'll ever see. And sometimes we don't see the return until, you know, one day when we all get to heaven and we get to see all those that were impacted through our giving, whether it was through missions or whether it was through supporting the guest speaker that came in, or supporting the youth program, or just supporting the church with your tithe. And no church should be a Dead Sea, and every church should give back out. The local church is just a great opportunity to, first of all, to be faithful with God, what God has given you, and to be a good steward, and to just take that seriously and for it to be a first fruit. And no one truly knows where all that goes and how it's impacting people and how it's changing lives and how it's providing an activity for a youth program, an activity for the kids program, and a missions project, even just a building project, and how it just year after year after year after year, just being faithful with what you have, all the people that are impacted through just being faithful with giving and tithing and supporting the church that you go to.
Tithing is a biblical concept, from the Old Testament, predating the law, under the ministry of Jesus. But it's an opportunity for us to put God first. It's an act of faith to do that. When people say, hey, I'm going to tithe, I'm going to give 10%. Not just 10%, I'm going to give the first 10%. And I think both in Sharon and I's case, we started this individually. Fortunately, we came from families that parents emphasized tithing, and that was something that was put in us at a young age. I mowed yards. I mowed my next door neighbor, Miss Ragland's yard, for $7. And I can remember tithing. I was probably 10 or 11, tithing 70 cents on Miss Ragland's yard. And, Sharon, before she was ever a pastor's wife, after she graduated from college, Sharon worked a couple jobs. She was always a hard worker. And, she's always emphasized to our boys, have you got your tithe? So we have three boys. And it's kind of precious because at a young age, she'd have those offering envelopes out. And you got any thoughts, memories about getting those?
Well, that goes back to when I have 3 siblings. And so when we were growing up, my mom would have a little notebook, and whether we earned, it might be 25 cents for picking weeds, or I would iron my dad's shirts and get 25 cents. She would have a little notebook, and she would always mark 10% of 25 cents. And so when it would add up to, an amount that would actually be dollars, she would clear it out and she would give us the money and we would put it in tithe. And so I think from an early age that started. So that's always been precious to my heart. And I tear up because it is precious, but when my kids were little, I always told Tom that is what I want to do, is because that's what God says to do, and God honors that. And so when they would make money, and for just little things, then I would always have the envelopes, and whether it was welcomed or not, everything you teach your kids isn't always a high five that they give back to you, but it's what you're imparting to them. And it's what you're creating in them, that discipline. You're training them the way they should go. And that was something that Tom and I believe in, is tithing. And so we would have their tithe ready and encourage them along that way. So that's where all that comes from. So there's nothing more precious. Well, there are lots of things that are precious, but one of the most precious things is to see your kids tithe and to be responsible with what God blesses them with. And I always tell them, guys, God's got more for you, and if you just keep what everything He gives you, He's not going to bless you with more. He wants you to be a good steward, even a small amount. And so God sees what is in the heart, and God sees what we do with what He blesses us with. And so that's where that comes from.
What blesses me is I can remember that when they got to the point when they could figure tithe fast, I got $5, and they knew, that's 50 cents. I got $10. I need to give $1. So they were able to figure that 10% pretty quickly. I do want to say one of our boys, you had mentioned they're not always excited about any discipline. They don't always want to brush their teeth. They don't always want to go to bed. There's disciplines and that children will push back on parents. And as they got older, I remember one time you were talking to one of the boys and said, hey, okay, that's great. You have this. Now we need to tithe on that. And one of the comments he made was, well, can't somebody else just do that?
Yes, I remember.
And I always thought that was funny, that nobody can tithe for you. You need to go ahead and do that on your own. So it's a step of faith. It's a holy thing to be able to honor the Lord. The tithes shall be holy unto the Lord in the Old Testament. And it's an act of obedience. I mean, you and I have gone through seasons like the Apostle Paul where we abounded, and then we've gone through seasons where we were stretched. But it's never been on the table, are we going to back off the tithe? We knew that we'd have to build the budget around the tithe. That's got to be the first thing. And then we may have to back other things out, but we got to keep that tithe on the table and put that, before the Lord. And then there is an obedience side, and there's a love side. It's not just loving the Lord with words, but deeds. And so when you give to the Lord your tithe, there's a discipline side, but there's a delight side. There's an opportunity. And I think as pastors, Sharon and I are just always touched when you see people that have really, we know that's a sacrifice for them to tithe. And it's so touching whenever, we've had people come by the church on a vacation. Well, I wanted to bring my tithe by or something. We're not focused on amounts, but we see a heart that touches us.
No, I agree. I was thinking back to our children, and you talked about the discipline, and sometimes it doesn't always work this way, but sometimes you have to develop that discipline, and then the love will come later. But sometimes you just have to act in obedience. And I remember, this is a funny story, but I remember with our two of our boys that I would come to them and they'd say, I know, Mom, you're collecting the tithe. And then they would talk about, my bill. And he goes, my bill for God. And I said, no, it's not a bill for God. I said, you look at it as you're worshiping the Lord with your tithe. You're bringing back to him an offering, presenting it back to him of what he's blessed you with. And so, sometimes you just have to, obedience can develop the love. And sometimes others, there is the love and they just need to create that discipline, but they want to, but it's just a discipline that they need to get into. But no, I agree. It is precious when you see people worshiping. And that's what it is. Tithing is an act of worship. And I tell my boys, whether you're at church at Good News Church, or maybe one day God moves you across the state or the country, wherever you attend church, you still need to support the church, the local church where you attend with your tithe. And it's an act of obedience, but it's also an act of worship. So it's not just because I'm the pastor's wife and my husband is the pastor, but it's because we go back to that. We're training them up in the way they should go.
Exactly. And I've told them a lot of times, hey guys, I tithe way before I was ever a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't tithe because I'm a pastor. I tithe because I'm a Christian. And what tithing does, it connects us to God's economy. And we know right now this economy is up and down and all around, but we know God's economy is stable. And it also helps us to put God first. Whenever you tithe, if you can put God first with your money, trust me, you'll find it easier to put God first in other areas of your life. And then, what it does? It allows you to put your finances towards something that's eternal. So much of what we get excited about is here today and gone tomorrow. Well, we're about to run out of time on today's program, but I just want to say thank you for listening, and we'll be back and we'll talk more about the importance of the local church.
Thank you for listening to today's message. You can hear this message again by visiting online at goodnewschurch.tv. To listen to this and many other messages by Pastor Tom, download the Good News Church mobile device app by searching for Good News Church Yukon through both the iTunes and Android stores. Through the website, you can also subscribe to the podcast. Pastor Tom invites you to visit Good News Church whenever you are in the greater Oklahoma City area. Good News is located at the intersection of Main Street and the Yukon Parkway in Yukon. He welcomes you to worship with them on Sundays at 10 a.m. Good News Church. It's a great place to be.